Bixton, my first and largest city ever in City Skylines 2, has just reached a population of 400,000 people, which in City Skylines terms is quite huge. I really love this city, and I know you guys appreciate it just as much, but there's one big problem plaguing it right now, a problem so big, it's almost preventing me from continuing to develop the city any further. That problem is simulation speed. No, not frame rate, but the speed at which the game's simulation runs at. The game speed has gotten so slow due to the amount of people living and driving around in the city that it's becoming incredibly difficult to play the game at all and to expand the city. In this video, we're going to uncover the cause of this problem and what we can do to fix it. Now, I've been working on Bixton since launch day, just over a year and some months ago, and it's grown from a measly little village to the metropolis it is today at just over 400,000 people. But at around 200,000 is when I started to notice something was wrong. Cars started driving a little slower, people started walking a little slower, and buildings started taking a lot more time to build. At this point, it didn't matter if I accelerated the game speed to max, nothing would change. I was seemingly stuck at 1x speed, and the problem became apparent as the city grew even more. Now sitting at just over 400k, the city has practically grinded to a halt, and everything appears to be in slow motion constantly. Cars are driving at a snail's pace on the highway, buildings take so long to construct that it takes forever to build even a small neighborhood. This is where my quest began to figure out why I was experiencing these issues despite having some pretty high-end PC specs. I'm rocking a Ryzen 9 5900X paired with an RTX 3080 graphics card and 64 gigs of DDR4 RAM. Although not current generation, these specs should be able to handle pretty much anything I throw at them, and they have for the last 3 years until City Skylines 2 came along. At first, I began playing around with the graphical settings of the game, thinking it might be related to my settings being set a little too high and my GPU was struggling, but nope, no matter what I try, setting everything to low, disabling VSync, disabling anti-aliasing, nothing improved as far as simulation speed goes. My frame rate improved significantly, but the game speed was unaffected. It was apparent my GPU had little bearing on the actual speed of the game, and if my GPU was struggling at any point and my frame rates were dropping lower than I felt comfortable with, I could simply lower the graphical settings of the game and they would improve. Furthermore, simply checking my task manager at one point made it blatantly obvious that this was a CPU related problem, as my poor 5900X was constantly pinned at 100% all the time when running Bixton. I had to dig a little deeper. Upon starting my research, I quickly discovered that I wasn't the only one having this problem. In fact, most people begin experiencing the exact same thing shortly after hitting 100,000 people to 200,000 people. Now, why is this? This is what I uncovered. City Skylines 2, much like a lot of other simulation games, is extremely CPU intensive. Every individual entity's pathfinding is simulated in your city. That means every person, every car, every train, boat in your city, the electricity flowing through your grid, the garbage being collected at each house, the entire production chain has to be simulated by your CPU. There comes a point when your CPU essentially gets saturated and cannot physically process any more functions. And the way the game is designed, in an effort to conserve frame rates when your CPU is maxed, the game will simply slow down your simulation speed to allow your processor to catch up. If this measure wasn't put in place, your frame rates would simply drop and your game would become very jittery and very choppy. And this problem gets worse and worse as your city grows until theoretically your CPU will hit a wall, and at which point who knows what can happen. Your game will probably stutter a lot and I'm sure it'll eventually just crash. Now, the fun part about all of this is we can actually get a visual representation of how much your game is being slowed down. Now, how you do this is you need to enable developer mode, and it's actually quite simple to do. First, what you want to do is find City Skylines 2 in your Steam game library. You're going to right click on it and go properties. Now, under selected launch option, you're going to type in -developer mode as seen below. And then you're simply going to launch the game and load into the city of your choice. Disclaimer, using developer mode has the potential to crash your game and break your saves. Some of its options cannot be undone, so frequent backups are recommended of your city. So use developer mode at your own risk. If you're just using it to monitor your game speed, you should be fine, but fair warning, don't go playing around and changing all kinds of settings in developer mode. If you don't feel comfortable enabling developer mode, you can always subscribe to the Performance Monitor mod by RC Aviator, which gives you the same information and can be quite useful as well. All right, so here we are loaded into Bixton. Please ignore the apparent death wave that we appear to be in the middle of. A lot of people are waiting for hearses here, but just ignore that. Now, what I want to bring your attention to for this moment is look how slow the snow is coming down here. If you were to start a new city and it were to begin snowing, it would come down a lot faster than this. And this is just an example of how much the game has slowed down for me with my city being at over 400,000 population now. Now, once we're booted into your city, what you're going to do is simply hit the tab key, and this is going to bring up your developer mode window. And what we're looking for here is under the simulation tab. So just simply click on simulation, and we're going to bring our attention down here to these two values, sim speed and smooth speed. So right now, if you can kind of see through my developer window, I'm running at 1x speed. It also says it here up at sim speed, and my smooth speed is at about a 0.4. So this should be at 1. When you start a brand new city and you hit play, your smooth speed should be near 1. If I go here and I accelerate the game speed to 2 times, your smooth speed should be at least 2 point something. And then if I go and accelerate it to maximum speed, which is 4x, your smooth speed should appear as 4 point something, or usually near 4, or it's normal for it to dip below 4 as well. You may see like 3.8, 3.9, little slowdowns here and there as your CPU just, struggles at a little minute second in time, maybe as new people are spawning in or whatever the case may be. It's normal for you to see some little blips below your desired speed. That's normal. It should be barely noticeable. And I can even go faster, and I can go to 8 times speed, which isn't normally possible in the game, but you can do this in developer mode. And if I notch it one more time to the right, it pauses the game. So if you noticed, all throughout this whole range of game speeds, my game is never even going above 1. I might get a little blip to like 0.7, 0.8, and then my smooth speed slows right back down to about a 0.4, no matter what speed I'm at. And this is just a representation of how slow the game is. So let's boot into a smaller city, and I can show you what you should see for maybe a small to medium-sized city. Now here, as another example, I am going to load into my Gasparilla County save, which is sitting just under 70,000 people. And let's take a look here at the difference in simulation speed. So here I am sitting at 1x, and you can see that my smooth speed is hovering just under 1. And that's okay. Even on a brand new city, you're never going to experience exactly 1. It's always going to dip just below it. You're probably going to experience 0.99, 0.98, just like I'm experiencing here. Same thing with 2x. If I accelerate the game, you can see that I'm experiencing just not under 1.95, maybe 1.96 something. So a little bit more of a slowdown, but mostly the exact same experience. Now things start to change here a little bit if I go to 4x, which is the max default speed that you're able to go at. And here you can see that my game is not quite making it to 4. I'm hovering around 3.6, 3.7, and it's normal for this to jump around a lot. But already at 70,000 people, I'm experiencing a little bit of slowdown at 4x. Now, this is normal because everything is just moving so much faster that your CPU just has to work that much harder in order to keep up. So even on a small to medium-sized city, you may experiencing some slowdowns at 4x or maybe even 2x if you have a little bit less of a performant CPU, and this is okay. But this just goes to show that eventually, maybe when I hit 100,000 people or 150,000 people, I may not even be able to get up to 3 point something. I may only be able to get up to 2 point whatever. There will come a time where it doesn't matter if I accelerate my game to maximum speed, which is 4x, my game may only be able to do up to 2x. And if my city grows and grows even further and I make it up to 250,000 people, there will come a point where my game literally cannot perform any faster than 1x. And that means that your city is essentially stuck on 1x speed. And this is usually fine because at 1x speed, your game is still kind of playable. Cars are moving at their normal speed down on the highway and people are walking at their normal pace. The game still is functional at that point. The real problem starts to appear when your game is not able to sustain even a 1 smooth speed. Once you start to dip below 1 and go down to maybe 0.8, 0.7, that is really the point when you're gonna start noticing some serious performance issues, and you're gonna notice that your game is gonna just be in a permanent kind of slow motion state all the time, and it may affect the playability of the game at that point. But this just goes to show what you can do to kind of monitor your smooth speed and your sim speed here. To summarize all this and to put it simply, the point at which your simulation speed begins to suffer is mostly determined by the CPU you have in your computer. Other hardware factors such as RAM amount, but it's mostly bound to your CPU. On top of that, there's 2 main CPU drivers that affect this even further, and that is your core and thread count of your processor and its clock speed, the speed at which your CPU runs at, which is measured in gigahertz. Clock speed can influence game performance, but it's less of a factor than the number of cores your processor has. For example, shown in this Linus Tech Tips video, we can see that City Skylines 2 can utilize up to 64 cores, which is absolutely insane. To put this in perspective, City Skylines could only use 1 core. Even if you had a 10 core or a 12 core CPU, City Skylines could only use 1. So the performance of the game was very limited. But back then in 2015, when the game was released, the belief was that games would benefit more from a higher clock speed, and higher core counts were usually reserved for productivity tasks. Most CPUs back then had maybe 2 or 4 cores on average, but now 10 years later, CPUs with higher core counts, usually 6 and up, are much more common, and game devs have started leveraging this, especially with sim games, which benefit immensely from more cores. Multi-core support was a huge upgrade for City Skylines 2 as it allowed for way more scalability. A little bit too much. You see, the problem in City Skylines 2 is all the guardrails have been taken off. We were given huge maps with no agent limitations, with a much more complex simulation to begin with. No fault of Colossal Order, of course, that's literally what fans were asking for. Rather than the game setting the limits like in City Skylines 1, your hardware becomes the physical limit of your city. For example, in City Skylines 1, your city was always limited to 65,000 agents. This means at one time, only 65,000 people or cars could exist in your city at one time. This is why massive cities would begin to appear empty, to the point where you would barely see any cars driving down on your streets, and you would only see service vehicles despite having hundreds of thousands of residents. It's as if everybody was locked indoors and only 65,000 people could exist and be out and about at one time. This was done in an effort to limit performance degradation as your city scaled. Remember that City Skylines 1 is a 10-year-old game at this point, and the average PC was a lot less powerful than today. Modern CPUs can handle big City Skylines 1 cities quite well nowadays, but back then, artificial limitations had to be put in place for the average gamer to have a good playable experience. This was mostly okay as the map sizes were relatively small, so by the time you got to the point of experiencing performance decreases, your little 9-tile or 25-tile map was likely getting full anyways, and you were probably going to move on to a new city soon. In City Skylines 2, no such agent limitations exist. Agent limitations wouldn't really work well for City Skylines 2 as it would break the complex simulation. That means hundreds of thousands of people and vehicles are potentially traveling around your city at the same time. And you can imagine that this puts even the best consumer CPUs through their paces as cities get larger. In theory, only the mighty AMD Ryzen Threadripper 7980X, a $7,000 64-core beast of a CPU, is capable of getting the most out of the game today. But even then, it will eventually begin to buckle as your ever-growing city eats away at its bandwidth. The only difference is your sim speed may only begin decreasing at 1 million population instead of 100,000. Buying anything more than the 7980X, you would be wasting money on hardware as the game will never be able to leverage the additional cores. Like I said, City Skylines 2 can only support up to 64. Only 64, am I right? And this is the problem. The average CPU on the Steam hardware survey last updated December 2024 has only 6 or 8 cores. In my case, even with 12 cores, 24 threads, performance starts degrading at about 200,000 people, with less than 50% of the map filled in. I can understand how frustrating it can be for players with less powerful systems seeing the game performance degrade with so much empty land available to build on. Land big enough to potentially support millions of people. I just wish the game was a little better optimized to allow all players across the board, whether you have an older CPU or the latest and greatest, to be able to get a bit farther along in their city without suffering major game-breaking performance issues. It's unrealistic for everybody to justify spending thousands and thousands of dollars on top-spec PCs. But on the flip side, I do embrace having no limits at all, allowing people with crazy rigs to completely let loose and push their systems to the absolute limit. I kind of like that the game doesn't tell me where my limits are, and it doesn't punish people with incredibly good PCs. I see both sides. After all, Colossal Order set out to bring us a truly next-generation builder, and that's exactly what they did. Mind you, after a year's worth of optimizing and tweaking, we got more in-depth realistic simulation, we got massive scale. The issue is current hardware doesn't allow for both at the same time. At least not for now. What we're seeing now is the same situation we've seen in 2007 with the release of Crysis. You know, can it run Crysis, where all those memes came about? This is exactly the same situation. Basically, the game exceeds what current hardware is capable of, and it's going to take a few years before we see the average PC be able to run the game more effectively. Now, the Colossal Order devs have alluded to further simulation and graphical optimization of the game, which should help a little bit. I'm not sure what this entails, I'm no coder, but one thing I would like to see that I think could help improve in performance is implementing the ability to dumb down or simplify pathfinding. The problem is pathfinding is very expensive. Each agent has to calculate multiple possible routes to their destination and scale that up to thousands or hundreds of thousands of agents, and that's a lot of moving parts that your CPU has to calculate. I understand why complex pathfinding is critical to how the game functions, but to some players, like the city painter type, may value more performance as super in-depth simulation may not be their top priority. Perhaps having a slider in the game settings where players can choose their level of pathfinding complexity, allowing players with powerful PCs to get the most complex simulation, whilst allowing players with perhaps older PCs not capable of handling such in-depth simulation to lower their complexity, thus improving game performance, thus making the game more enjoyable for them. Something that could be maybe tied to some graphical settings presets. For example, if you choose to run on the low graphics presets, it would automatically tone down the game's pathfinding to further increase the game's performance. And plus, I'm sure there are players with great PCs who might value higher frame rates over a complex simulation. The reason why I'm so confident this could work is because about a year ago, we had exactly that. Last year, way before Paradox Mods was live, a modder by the name of City Player released the Traffic Custom mod, which essentially changed the behavior of your citizens to make pathfinding much more efficient. The mod also allowed players some customization on how their citizens traveled around town. For example, you could set how much your citizens prefer a particular mode of public transit over taking their own vehicle. This mod resulted in dramatic performance increases as claimed by the hundreds of comments on the mod page. This mod was only available on third-party sites way before Paradox Mods and had to be installed manually. But unfortunately, the mod is no longer available or compatible with the latest version of the game, as the creator has stopped supporting it entirely. I really hope it makes a comeback one day, but it just goes to show, with a little bit more optimization, it's probably possible to make the game run really well on even some lower spec computers, totally removing the need to have all these customization options I was talking about. That would be the ultimate dream, and I hope we get there one day. But luckily, there's a couple things that we can do in the meantime as we wait for more optimization and updates to come to the game. The first thing I would recommend doing is setting your performance preference under general settings to simulation speed. Basically what this setting does is pull some CPU resources away from graphical rendering and assigns it to simulation tasks. In my experience, it hasn't made much of a difference, but your mileage may vary. The setting is there, so might as well use it. Second, building your public transit network to be super efficient is an effective way of improving performance. By making public transit the obvious choice to get to work or school, your citizens won't have to think as hard on how to get to their destinations, and that means less pathfinding, which will free up some CPU bandwidth. Be careful not to give your citizens too many transit options, as that will drive up pathfinding cost. But ultimately, I think the best and most effective way of ensuring your game runs smoothly is keep things small. Choose to build on a map with lots of mountains, or maybe on a small island. This will force you to think small, and in my experience, this creates an extra element of challenge, which makes the game more fun. Not having the luxury of space forces you to think more critically of where to place certain things. Decisions matter more. Need a new power plant? Just remember, your decisions will have a bigger impact on your city, especially when you can no longer simply plop that pollution-belching coal plant in the far corner of the map. Building small also instinctively makes you spend a little bit more time and effort in each area of your city as you try to make it all fit, making each area a little bit more sentimental. That's how I feel anyways. I've always had a sense of pride when successfully building that new highway interchange near downtown, being forced to somehow squeeze everything in between a bunch of buildings, and somehow making it all work in the end. So these three items are my top methods of improving simulation speed. I get it if it's not the answer you were hoping for, but short of overclocking your CPU to 20 GHz and submerging your PC in a vat of liquid nitrogen to prevent it from melting itself, or simply buying a better CPU, this is what we've got for now. That being said, I remain optimistic that the game is going to improve over time as more fixes and optimizations are introduced, and I'm also hopeful that some mods may appear on the Paradox Mod store, which could solve a lot of these performance problems, as we've briefly seen before. With Bixton, I set out to build a massive American-themed city, complete with endless suburban sprawl. It's now clear that I might not be able to achieve that goal after all, but that's okay, because in all honesty, I'm ready to move on to another project. The only thing left to do in Bixton anyways is more suburban sprawl and maybe a bit of countryside. Knowing what I know now, I'm ready to start a new city built on a map better suited for the game's current limitations. We now have access to hundreds of wonderful creator-made maps on Paradox Mods, something that wasn't possible when I started Bixton. So I'm excited to browse through them all, and I'm sure I'm going to choose something really cool for my next big project. And maybe in the future, when I get my hands on the latest and greatest Threadripper CPU, I'll revisit the idea of building a massive metropolis. And with all that being said, thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you learned a thing or two, and hopefully this video will help you improve your City Skylines experience. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and also leave a comment down below letting me know what you think. Until the next one, take care, guys.